the stage, and the void. How attention replaced reality, why instability became profitable, and what it reveals about us. By Elias Winter, December 15th, 2025. Read by an automated voice. Chapter 1. A Country Performed. There is a particular kind of table that has become one of America's most common civic architectures. It is not a kitchen table, not a council table, not a table where bread is broken or decisions are made in the presence of consequence. It is a studio table, clean, lit, engineered, built for confrontation that is safe enough to repeat tomorrow. Behind it sits a person with a microphone, a camera, a monitor, and a practiced face. The room is small. The voice is large. The certainty is absolute. And the audience is nowhere. The country now experiences itself through these tables. The set design varies. Sometimes it's a sleek podcast studio with wood paneling and leather chairs, made to feel like seriousness. Sometimes it's a streamer's bedroom with neon lights and a shelf of books never opened, made to feel like authenticity. Sometimes it's a split screen, faces in boxes, each one a performer, each one framed like a sovereign kingdom, each one speaking to an absence. The strange part is not that these people exist. Every era produces talkers. The strange part is that we have begun to treat the talk as if it were governance, as if the commentary were the thing itself. We don't merely consume interpretations of reality. We consume reality as interpretation. This is not the old world of persuasion. It is not even the old world of propaganda. It is something more intimate and more corrosive. A society that has outsourced its sense-making to performers who make their living by keeping the audience inside a feeling. The feeling changes by tribe. On one side it is dread and disgust. On another, it is grievance and triumph. On another, it is irony as anesthesia, laughter that keeps you from screaming. But the structure is the same, a constant stream of interpretation engineered to hold attention, and attention that becomes mistaken for participation. The nation has become a stage where everyone is watching everyone else watch. I can tell you exactly what this looks like in the body, because it has happened to me, and it has happened to almost everyone I know. You open a feed for a moment, just to check. You tell yourself you're being responsible, staying informed. You watch one clip, then another. The voice says what you already feared, or what you already hoped. It gives shape to a formless anxiety. It names an enemy. It offers a diagnosis. It offers a plot. It offers a villain. It offers the relief of certainty. And then, before you realize it, you have spent an hour in a room you did not choose, inside a nervous system you no longer control. When you close the app, nothing is resolved. The world is not clearer. You are not wiser, but you are hotter, more suspicious, more reactive, less capable of patience, less capable of love. You have become a better customer of more of the same. This is the first signature of the new public square. It does not produce clarity. It produces compulsion. And it would be easy, cheap, satisfying to say the problem is simply the performers, that they are shallow, vain, or corrupt. Sometimes they are. Often they are. But that is not the root. The root is that a civilizational hunger has found a market. People are anxious, lonely, unmoored, and starved of meaning that is anchored in reality rather than narrative. The stage did not invent this hunger. It merely discovered how to monetize it. Look at the ambient backdrop we now accept as normal. A country whose news arrives like weather alerts. This incident, that shooting, this scandal, that war, this disaster, this court decision, this collapse, this betrayal, this unprecedented thing that becomes precedent within a week. The details change, the atmosphere does not. The air carries instability. The public mood is a permanent halfway state between boredom and panic, sadness and rage, fatigue and readiness. In a healthier world, there would be stabilizers, institutions, leaders, rituals, shared sources of truth that could metabolize shock and return the collective nervous system to baseline. But baseline is now contested. Everyone is afraid to be the one who speaks calmly, because calm looks like complicity, or weakness, or irrelevance. Silence looks like surrender. Qualification looks like betrayal. Nuance looks like cowardice. And in a market where attention is the currency, the only unforgivable sin is to be ignored. So nobody stabilizes. Not the platforms, which profit from arousal. Not the pundit class, which lives on escalation. Not the politicians, who have learned that governance is slower than theater and less rewarding than provocation. Not the audience, who has learned that outrage is a form of participation that doesn't require responsibility. Instead, everyone adds oil. And oil is abundant because it is cheap. Anger costs nothing to produce, and it pays immediately. This is what makes the stage so dangerous. It turns the real anxieties of a wounded society into an industrial feedstock. Rage becomes fuel. Conspiracy becomes product. Tribal belonging becomes retention. Every day's existential threat becomes tomorrow's forgotten content, replaced by a new existential threat before the nervous system can recover. The result is not mobilization in the noble sense. It is mobilization as capture. To mobilize today is not primarily to persuade. It is to seize attention, harden identity, and then point that identity toward a target. It is to keep the audience inside a storyline where leaving feels like treason. It is to replace thought with loyalty. It is to turn politics into fandom, and fandom into a substitute for community. The performers talk as if they are building movements. Often they are. But movements without embodied relationships rot. They become crowds. Crowds become mobs. Mobs become markets. And markets reward whatever keeps the crowd inside the trance. That trance is what I mean when I say the country is being performed. Performance is not merely acting. It is a mode of existence where the primary relationship is not to truth or reality, but to audience response. The performer does not ask, "Is this true?" first. The performer asks, "Will this land? Will this spike? Will this spread? Will this keep them?" And to be fair, many of them no longer even ask those questions consciously. The system asks them. The metrics ask them. The platform asks them. Their payroll asks them. Their audience asks them. And because the audience is not a room of faces, it is a set of numbers. The performer is freed from a constraint that has governed human speech for most of history. The immediate presence of other human beings. Faces regulate. Bodies regulate. A room regulates. A family dinner regulates. A village regulates. Even a hostile crowd regulates, because you can feel when you are losing them, when you are lying, when you are becoming absurd. The camera is different. The camera grants you sovereignty without resistance. It allows you to build a world in which you are always the center, always correct, always wronged, always heroic, always necessary. This is why the Internet produces not just commentators, but miniature sovereigns, each one a leader of a fictional nation composed of subscribers, each one surrounded by loyalists who defend them as if defending the self, each one fighting rival sovereigns in petty wars that look, from the outside, like a soap opera. Betrayals, feuds, schisms, purges, reconciliations. drama that mimics politics while functioning as entertainment. The audience watches the war between leaders who have no obligation to bear the consequences of the war they incite. And still, not all of them are garbage. There are genuinely serious minds on these platforms. There are historians who speak with discipline and depth. There are comedians who tell the truth sideways and expose the sickness by refusing to dress it up as moral urgency. There are people who stabilize by giving context, by refusing the existential frame, by speaking like adults. But exceptions do not change selection pressures. The system rewards the loud, the certain, the wounded ego, the fast reaction, the perpetual emergency, and it slowly punishes those who insist on time, humility, and complexity. Even the best voices have to survive inside the incentive structure. And survival has a price. The price is that speech becomes shaped not by conscience, but by the invisible hand of engagement. Which raises the deeper question that sits beneath everything. Why are we so vulnerable to this? The answer is not only that the performers are manipulative. The answer is that many of us are empty in ways we don't want to admit. Not empty in the moralistic sense, empty in the structural sense, disembedded, unheld, disconnected from rituals and roles that give life weight. Single people living alone, families scattered across continents, friendships thinned into texts, community reduced to content, purpose reduced to productivity, love reduced to sexuality, then reduced further to pornographic stimulus, faith reduced to aesthetic, politics reduced to identity, identity reduced to consumption. When life loses embodied fullness, a person becomes hungry for significance, and the stage offers significance on demand. It offers a feeling of being part of something. It offers a language for your anger. It offers a narrative for your fear. It offers enemies for your confusion. It offers certainty as a substitute for belonging. It offers truth as an adrenaline delivery mechanism. And here is the line I do not want to hide behind. I recognize this because I have been inside it. There is a version of me that could sit at a table and talk into a camera. There is a version of me that would enjoy the attention. There is a version of me that would love the power of being listened to without interruption. There is a version of me that would turn my insight into a product and my rage into a brand. There is a version of me that would call it mission while watching the metrics like a heartbeat monitor. That version is not foreign. It is adjacent. It is a temptation that lives wherever a human being is starved and wants to be seen. So the essay you are reading is not a denunciation from above. It is an attempt to name the architecture of a shared wound. America is being performed because reality is now too heavy to hold without a script. And the scripts are being written by those who can convert anxiety into attention. What follows is an attempt to describe how that happened, not as scandal, not as partisan complaint, but as a structural transformation in how a society knows what is real, who gets to speak, and what the speaking is for. Because if reality has become a stage, we need to ask a question that is older than any platform. Who profits from the performance? And what does it cost the soul of a people to live inside it? Chapter 2. When Attention Becomes the Arbiter of Truth. The old arrangement was imperfect, but it had a basic architecture. Events happened in the world, institutions, newspapers, courts, universities, scientific bodies attempted to describe them. Citizens disagreed about meaning, but the disagreement usually occurred on top of a shared assumption that there existed something like a common record, however contested, against which claims could be measured. That arrangement is now broken, not because facts disappeared, but because the public no longer encounters facts, as facts. It encounters them as content. And content has a different primary law. Content is governed by attention. Attention is the scarce resource. Everything else, truth, precision, humility, context, is secondary unless it serves that scarcity. This is the inversion that quietly reorganized public life. The metric became the judge. Not the judge in the official sense. The judge in the functional sense. The thing that decides what lives, what spreads, what becomes, what everyone is talking about. And therefore, what counts as real. In the new arrangement, reality is not what happened. Reality is what can hold the collective gaze. The mechanism is mundane, almost boring, which is why it is so potent. The human mind is not built to resist constant novelty, constant threat cues, constant social comparison, constant outrage. So the platforms learned to reward whatever most efficiently activates the nervous system. And the creators learned, consciously or unconsciously, to speak in the dialect the platform rewards. The dialect is recognizable. Certainty without cost speed over verification, moral theater over analysis, personalization of systemic problems. This one villain did it. Existential framing. This changes everything. Repetition. Because repetition stabilizes identity escalation, because baseline becomes boring. Once you recognize the dialect, you start seeing its effects everywhere. Not only on the loudest fringe channels, but across mainstream media, across politics, across corporate communication, across ordinary conversation. People speak as if they are auditioning for relevance. A statement becomes true when it is repeatable, shareable, clippable. The truthiness is not about correspondence with reality. It is about fitness for circulation. That is the new selection pressure, mimetic fitness. And a mimetically fit claim has predictable features. It must be simple enough to transmit. It must have an emotional hook. It must have an enemy. It must offer a clear moral posture the follower can inhabit. It must provide the user with something they can do, share, dunk, join, condemn, so that watching feels like agency. This is where the collapse of trust in institutions becomes more than a political talking point. When people lose confidence in the old fact production apparatus, whether for good reasons or bad, there is no longer an agreed gatekeeper. The gate is removed. The feed becomes the gate. But the feed is not designed to gate truth. It is designed to gate attention. So the vacuum is filled by whoever can manufacture attention most reliably. This is why the relationship between legacy news and influencer culture is not a clean replacement. It is a pipeline. News outlets still do much of the expensive labor, reporting, gathering, verifying, being sued, correcting. But the public increasingly meets that labor downstream, after it has been cut into fragments, reorganized into narratives, and injected into tribal identities. A single story can now generate multiple realities. One reality tells you it's proof of collapse and betrayal. Another tells you it's proof of the other side's depravity. Another tells you it's staged. Another tells you it's a distraction. Another tells you it's what they don't want you to know. And each reality comes with a ready-made community of believers, each one convinced that the other communities are either brainwashed or evil. This is not a failure of intelligence, it is a failure of epistemic infrastructure. People are trying to make sense of complexity using tools that were designed to maximize engagement, and then they blame themselves, or each other, for being confused. The deeper problem is that the old institutions were never merely conveyors of facts. They were also stabilizers of time. They slowed the world down. Editors created friction. Publication cycles created pauses. Standards created a minimum threshold for what could be said without consequence. Even when those institutions were captured, biased, or wrong, they still functioned as a kind of temporal dam against the flood of immediate reaction. That dam is gone. Now the public is forced to process reality at the speed of the feed. Every hour a new outrage, every day a new betrayal, every week a new existential emergency. There is no digestion. There is only ingestion. The inability to digest produces a predictable emotional pattern. A person becomes either numb or paranoid. Sometimes both. Numb to ordinary suffering, paranoid about imagined plots, and then, because the nervous system cannot tolerate indefinite ambiguity, it seeks closure. It seeks a storyline that converts complexity into certainty. This is the moment where interpretation becomes not a layer on top of facts, but the thing that precedes facts. People choose their interpretation first, often the one that best soothes or weaponizes their anxiety. And then they select facts that fit. The mind was always capable of this. What's new is the scale and industrialization of it. The feed turns this human tendency into a business model. It takes the most sensitive parts of the psyche, the desire for coherence, the desire for belonging, the desire to be safe, the fear of being naive, and it turns them into levers. Each lever corresponds to an engagement behavior. Each behavior produces signal. Each signal trains the machine. The machine then feeds you more of what moved you. This is why the storylines intensify. A person who begins by just staying informed ends up needing stronger doses of certainty and outrage to feel anything at all. The content becomes more apocalyptic, more accusatory, more moralized, more total. Not because reality necessarily became more total, but because the nervous system has been trained to require totality to stay engaged. This is how attention becomes the arbiter of truth, not as a philosophical claim, but as an operational reality. What spreads becomes what's discussed. What's discussed becomes what feels real. What feels real becomes what people act on. And then action, even misguided action, retroactively proves the reality. If everyone is acting like the world is collapsing, the world begins to collapse. So the stage doesn't merely reflect instability. It manufactures it, amplifies it, and makes it contagious. At this point, it is tempting to locate blame in the easiest place: the influencer, the algorithm, the platform, the politician. They deserve plenty of it. But the architecture is broader and more tragic. The truth is that the public square has become a market, and in that market, the highest bidder is not always money. Often it is emotion. Fear bids high. Rage bids high. Humiliation bids high. Vindication bids high. Certainty bids high. Calm bids low. Nuance bids low. Patience bids low. So even when truth is present, it loses auctions. And the most dangerous part is not that falsehood wins sometimes, it's that the mind begins to treat winning attention as the definition of truth. The soul begins to confuse visibility with reality. Once that confusion sets in, everything becomes performance, because performance is what survives. That is the mechanical core of what follows. If you want to understand the influencer class, you have to begin here. They did not create the inversion. They are its beneficiaries and its prisoners. And the audience is not merely deceived. The audience is being retrained in what it expects speech to be. Not a practice of description, but a tool for dominance, belonging, and relief. In the next chapter, the essay moves closer to the human interface of this machine, what the influencer relationship actually is, why it feels intimate, and why that intimacy is mostly illusion. Chapter 3. The Lie of Two-Way Intimacy. The most effective trick the new media order pulled was not ideological, It was relational. It convinced millions of people that they were not watching a performer, but participating in a relationship. The language is everywhere. Community, family, you guys, we, I'm just talking with you, I'm one of you. The creator speaks with the tone of closeness, the cadence of confession, the vulnerability of a friend. They share personal details. They talk about their mental health. They show you their kitchen. They tell you about their kids, their dog, their struggles. They glance off camera as if someone is in the room with them, and the audience feels, often sincerely, that something mutual is occurring. But structurally, it is not mutual. It is not even close. It is a one-to-many broadcast relationship wearing the costume of intimacy. The audience receives a face, a voice, a personality, someone to attach to. The creator receives aggregates, numbers, trends, retention, churn. Even when a creator reads comments, they don't meet a human being. They meet a stream, a pattern, a mood, a temperature. The intimacy is real for the viewer. It is not real for the system. This is why the relationship can become so powerful, so possessive, so tender, and so pathological, all at once. A person can feel genuinely seen by someone who has never seen them. In older forms of fandom, this asymmetry was obvious. You loved a band. The band did not love you back. You admired an actor. The actor didn't know you existed. The contract was clear. The longing had a shape. The internet blurred that boundary. It introduced the illusion of proximity. A creator can reply to your comment. They can like your post. They can say your name on a live stream. They can read your donation message aloud. The viewer experiences this as recognition, sometimes as spiritual recognition. But these are rationed tokens, not relationship. They function like a slot machine pays out, intermittently, unpredictably, just enough to keep you pulling the lever. This is not a metaphor. It is how the platforms are built. Variable reinforcement is one of the strongest known mechanisms for compulsive behavior. And the new intimacy economy uses it at scale. You can see the lie most clearly in the one thing the relationship cannot tolerate: disappointment. If a viewer disagrees with a creator, the disagreement is rarely treated as a disagreement between adults. It is treated as betrayal. Why? Because what is being threatened is not an opinion, but an attachment. The viewer says, "I thought you were one of us." The creator hears, "My retention is at risk." This is the origin of a strange modern phenomenon: people experiencing political or cultural shifts as if they were relationship breakups. A creator turns. A creator sold out. A creator changed. The audience mourns, rages, grieves. It feels personal because the intimacy was personal, but it was personal in only one direction. That one-directional intimacy produces two predictable outcomes. First, it produces audience capture. A creator begins with a set of views. The audience forms. Over time, the creator learns what the audience rewards, which words produce applause, which topics produce money, which enemies produce a spike. The audience becomes the invisible editor. This is where pandering begins, but it rarely begins as conscious cynicism. It begins as survival. The creator's rent is now tied to a mood. Their status is tied to the audience's appetite. Their identity becomes dependent on being needed. So they are slowly trained to repeat what keeps the machine stable. A creator who resists capture must endure punishment. Fewer views, angry comments, unsubscribes, sponsor loss. Most people cannot endure that for long, especially if their entire life has been reorganized around the channel. So the creator adapts. And the second outcome is even darker. It produces micro-cults. Not every creator is a cult leader in temperament, but the structure moves in that direction Because cult dynamics are simply the most efficient way to keep an audience from leaving. A microcult has recognizable features, an in-group language outsiders framed as blind, evil, or manipulated a sense that leaving is betrayal, escalating moral stakes, a leader who is always under attack, a narrative of persecution that binds the group rituals of loyalty, sharing, defending, donating, piling on enemies. Again, this does not require a mastermind. It is the natural shape of retention under ideological pressure. And because the relationship is presented as mutual, the audience feels entitled. That entitlement is the emotional engine of online outrage, the feeling that I gave you my loyalty, so you owe me alignment. This is why influencer worlds fracture in dramatic schisms. A single deviation becomes a crisis. A moment of uncertainty becomes a scandal. A correction becomes humiliation. The creator cannot merely evolve. They must either double down or be cast out. So even honest creators become trapped in performance. They start speaking not to the world, but to their base. They begin to anticipate backlash. Their speech narrows. Their curiosity dies. They learn what not to say. The platform calls this brand building. The audience calls this being real. The effect is the same. A human being reduced to a predictable output stream. And while all of this happens, the viewer's world quietly changes. A person who spends enough time inside these relationships begins to treat parasocial intimacy as a substitute for embodied intimacy. It is less risky. It is always available. It requires no negotiation, no compromise, no vulnerability that could actually wound you in return. You can be loyal without being challenged. You can feel part of something without being known. It is community without friction. But community without friction is not community. It is consumption. This is one reason the modern public square feels unstable. The movements that form online are not held together by real relationships, but by synchronized emotion. Emotion can coordinate quickly, but it cannot sustain. So the system must keep producing new emergencies to keep the synchronization alive. This is why everything becomes existential. Existential framing is a retention strategy. If the stakes are total, leaving feels immoral. And once leaving feels immoral, the creator has achieved what every platform rewards: a stable audience. At this point, you might object, but some creators are genuine. Some are thoughtful. Some truly care. Yes, some do. There are historians who educate and contextualize. There are comedians who puncture hysteria. There are writers who refuse the tribal frame. But sincerity does not remove asymmetry. Even the best creator cannot turn a one-to-many broadcast relationship into friendship. They can only behave more ethically inside an unethical structure. They can only choose restraint where the system rewards escalation. The lie is not that creators have no feelings. The lie is that the relationship is mutual. And once you see that lie, you begin to see why the entire influencer ecosystem produces such brittle, reactive leaders. A leader who is genuinely accountable must face the eyes of the people they lead. They must be held by reality. They must bear consequences. The influencer faces numbers. Numbers do not forgive. They do not understand. They only rise or fall. So the creator learns to fear silence more than falsehood. They learn to fear boredom more than dishonesty. They learn to fear losing the crowd more than losing the truth. And the audience, trained by the same incentives, learns to mistake constant emotional stimulation for meaning. This is the architecture of two-way intimacy. It makes people feel held, while leaving them structurally alone. The next chapter goes deeper into the psychological environment that makes this possible. The missing face, the tyranny of the lens, and what it does to a human being when their entire moral economy is mediated by metrics rather than bodies. Chapter 4. The Camera, the Ego, and the Missing Face. There is a reason the new public square feels unnervingly inhuman, even when it is filled with human faces. Those faces are not faces in the ordinary sense. They do not look back at you. They do not register your presence as a person. They do not respond to your silence, your discomfort, your confusion, your grief. They are images, performative masks optimized for reception, not relationship. A face in a room is a moral constraint. A face on a screen is a product surface. Most human speech evolved under conditions of proximity. You spoke to someone who could interrupt you, someone who could walk away, someone whose eyes could communicate boredom, pain, skepticism, contempt, admiration, someone whose presence forced you to regulate yourself. Even the desire to impress had limits, because the other person's body held you in the world. The camera abolishes this. It offers a kind of sovereignty that looks like freedom but behaves like intoxication. You can speak without interruption, build a world without resistance, and experience influence without friction. You are never forced to sit with the consequences of your tone, because the consequences are deferred into numbers you can interpret however you want. This is where the missing face becomes the central psychological fact of the influencer era. A human being becomes sane through correction. Not only correction by facts, but correction by other people's reality. The ordinary world constantly supplies micro-frictions that keep the ego in proportion: a co-worker's confusion, a friend's raised eyebrow, a partner's disappointment, a child's indifference to your self-mythology. These frictions are humiliating in the best sense. They return you to the human scale. The influencer setup removes most of them. In their place, it offers two distortions: the distortion of the mirror and the distortion of the crowd. The mirror distortion is the self watching itself. The performer is always monitoring their own face, their own voice, their own persona, their own brand. Even creators who begin with sincerity cannot avoid the gradual shift from what I think to what I sound like when I think. Over time, the self becomes a performance object. The inner voice is replaced by an outer script. The crowd distortion is worse, because it is not a crowd of bodies. It is a crowd of signals. A real crowd can be unruly, but it is also corrective. It can boo. It can leave. It can confront you in the parking lot. It can refuse your frame. It can make you feel shame. It can make you hesitate. Most importantly, it can make you understand in your bones that your words have landed inside other lives. The algorithmic crowd is different. It is never present. It cannot be addressed directly. It cannot be reasoned with. It cannot be loved. It can only be stimulated. So the performer learns to treat the public as a nervous system to be manipulated rather than as persons to be encountered. Once that shift occurs, the moral economy of speech collapses into tactics. Not because the creator wakes up one morning and decides to become cynical. The cynicism is a downstream adaptation. The environment produces it the way a swamp produces mosquitoes. To speak online, day after day, to an invisible multitude, is to exist inside a peculiar psychological trap. You are intensely exposed, but not truly seen. You are surrounded by voices, but not held by relationship. You are praised, but rarely understood. You are attacked, but rarely confronted by a real human being. This produces a predictable personality shape. You can see it across tribes, across genres, across ideologies, because it is not ideological. It is environmental. The shape includes inflated self-importance. If you can command attention at scale, your mind naturally starts treating your voice as historically significant. The intoxicating part is not the money. It is the feeling of being central. Hypervigilance, because the audience is not a room but a swarm. The creator never knows where the next wound will come from. A clipped phrase, a bad faith interpretation, a rival's call-out, a sponsor's discomfort. The self becomes defensively alert, fragility and reactivity. The more a person's identity fuses with a public persona, the less they can tolerate critique. Critique becomes existential because it threatens not only ego, but livelihood. Performative conviction. To survive, the creator learns to speak with certainty, even when unsure. Doubt is punished by the market. Nuance reads as weakness. Hesitation loses attention. Persecution narrative. When you live by attention, any drop in attention feels like suppression. Any critique feels like a coordinated attack. Any rival becomes an enemy. The story of being hunted becomes a stabilizing identity. It binds the audience and justifies escalation. This is why influencer feuds have the emotional texture of domestic fights rather than intellectual disagreements. They are not arguing about truth. They are fighting over status, legitimacy, and audience loyalty, fighting over the thing that keeps them alive. It is also why even relatively intelligent people can begin to sound like caricatures. They are not becoming stupid. They are being trained into a rhetorical posture that optimizes for the platform. Their speech becomes more extreme, more moralized, more totalizing, because totalizing speech keeps the viewer inside the trance. At this point, the audience often tells itself a comforting story, that the creator is authentic. But authenticity is not a stable property of a person. It is a property of a relationship. When the relationship is structurally one-sided and the feedback loops are metric-driven, authenticity can become a performance style. The appearance of intimacy, the tone of sincerity, the ritual of confession, the curated vulnerability that binds the follower more tightly. This is not to say all creators are frauds. It is to say the environment turns sincerity into a technique. And once sincerity becomes a technique, the line between conviction and manipulation dissolves. The missing face affects the audience too. A viewer begins to treat the creator's face as a stable presence in life. Morning coffee, commute, late-night loneliness. The face becomes familiar, comforting, even regulating. The viewer's nervous system learns the creator as a mood stabilizer or mood escalator. The viewer's perception of reality becomes mediated not by the world, but by the cadence of a voice. This is why the influencer ecosystem can feel like a surrogate family. There are leaders, enemies, moral codes, rituals, betrayals, forgiveness arcs. But unlike a real family, it demands no reciprocity and offers no true care. It can take from you endlessly without ever having to look into your eyes. This is what makes it uniquely potent as a political and cultural force. Because politics is, at bottom, a system for coordinating strangers. And the modern platforms have found the cheapest coordination mechanism ever discovered: synchronized emotion delivered through parasocial faces at scale. Once you have that, you no longer need robust institutions to mobilize people. You need narrators, you need faces, you need voices that can reliably push the buttons. This is the step that turns performance into power. The camera produces a class of people who are emotionally volatile, rhetorically certain, and structurally unaccountable. The platform then elevates them into de facto leaders because they can hold attention. The audience follows because attention has become the currency of meaning. The whole machine spins faster because it feeds on the anxiety it amplifies. The most important point is not that this produces bad leaders. It is that it produces leaders who are not built to carry consequence. Their influence is real. Their accountability is not. And when a society begins to be led by unaccountable performers, the direction of the society becomes a function of what is most stimulative, not what is most true or wise. That is the psychological groundwork. The next chapter moves from the performer to the crowd. Not the crowd as a metaphor, but the crowd as a newly legible, newly steerable, newly synchronizable mass. Because the true novelty of this era is not the existence of demagogues. It is that the machinery now allows demagoguery to scale continuously, cheaply, and invisibly, until the mass itself becomes the medium. Chapter 5. Mobilizing the Mass. For most of history, the masses were not an object you could continuously see, measure, and steer. They were a rumor of force that appeared in bursts. A crowd formed in a square. A mob surged down a street. A strike shut down a factory. A rally filled a field. Mass energy existed, but it was episodic, local, and costly. It required proximity. It required logistics. It required risk. It required bodies. Bodies that could be injured, arrested, or turned away by rain and fatigue. The Internet did something unprecedented. It made the crowd permanent. Not permanent as a physical gathering, but permanent as an addressable surface. A standing reservoir of attention. A visible mass mood. A continuously measurable public temperature. The crowd did not have to assemble anymore. It could be summoned, steered, and intensified without anyone leaving their bed. This is why modern mobilization has a different texture than older political life. It feels less like persuasion and more like hypnosis, less like argument and more like synchronization. A mass is not primarily a set of beliefs. It is a set of bodies moving together, and bodies move together most reliably through emotion, not through thought. Thought is slow. Emotion is fast. Emotion is contagious. Platforms discovered that contagion scales better than reasoning. So the Internet became the first true infrastructure for continuous mass contagion. Fear, outrage, humiliation, triumph, disgust, piped into millions of nervous systems in real time, day after day, until a nation begins to experience itself less as a deliberative community and more as a perpetually triggered organism. This is where your earlier observation sharpens. What looks like mobilization often functions like brainwashing, not because people are stupid, but because the system is optimized for capturing attention by capturing feeling. Brainwashing, in its simplest form, is not the insertion of a new idea. It is the installation of a new reflex. A reflex that determines what you notice, what you fear, who you hate, what counts as evidence, and what counts as betrayal. The modern platforms are not primarily ideological devices. They are reflex factories. They build reflexes through repetition and reward. The cycle is simple. Anxiety exists in the background. Economic pressure, cultural disorientation, institutional distrust, real violence, real instability. A narrator gives it an object, a villain, a plot, a betrayal, a threat. The audience receives emotional relief. Coherence replaces confusion. Certainty replaces ambiguity. The platform rewards the exchange. Likes, shares, watch time, donations. The machine learns and returns a stronger dose. Over time, the audience doesn't merely believe a story. It becomes physiologically organized around that story. This is why the modern mass feels different from a historic crowd. Historic crowds were often hungry, furious, desperate. But they were also forced to confront the physicality of their own force. They had to gather. They had to risk. They had to see each other as bodies. The online mass can be coordinated while remaining atomized. This is the crucial innovation. mass unity without mass togetherness. A million isolated people can be made to feel like a single entity, without ever touching, building, or sacrificing anything together. The unity is not social, it is effective. It is a synchronized mood delivered through 1,000 screens. And because the unity is effective, it is brittle. A real community can hold disagreement because it is bound by reciprocal need. People need each other to survive. They share histories, obligations, and consequences. An online mass is bound by emotional alignment. The moment emotional alignment breaks, it shatters into schisms, feuds, and purges. This is why influencer ecosystems and online movements behave like organisms with autoimmune disorders. They are constantly attacking internal deviations because the only glue they have is shared posture. And this is where existential framing becomes the central rhetorical technology. If the stakes are existential, if the threat is total, then dissent becomes treason and nuance becomes sabotage. Existential framing is not merely a dramatic style, it is a binding agent. It keeps the mass coherent by turning complexity into a moral emergency. The phrase, "we are under attack," is a coordination device. It creates a single nervous system. Once a mass becomes a single nervous system, it can be steered with minimal effort. You don't need to convince people, you need to trigger them. You need to point the shared reflex at a target. This is what modern mobilization often is, not a movement toward a positive vision, but a periodic reactivation of a shared fear. And fear, unlike hope, does not require clarity. Hope requires construction. Hope demands details. Fear can live on shadows. That is why conspiracy thrives here. Conspiracy is not merely false information, it is an emotional product that offers the user a feeling that the world is intelligible, that hidden hands explain their pain, that they are not powerless because they see. Conspiracy is a counterfeit form of agency. It turns impotence into vigilance. Vigilance feels like action. It is not, but it keeps the mass awake, and the platforms reward what keeps the mass awake. So the public square becomes sleepless. In a sleepless public square, everything becomes a signal of danger. This is where the crowd's visibility becomes its own corruption. Because the platforms quantify everything, they allow people to experience public mood not through lived reality, but through trending topics and viral clips. A person doesn't ask, "What do people I know think?" They ask, "What is everyone saying?" And everyone is a number on a screen. This is an epistemic disaster because it turns perception into a hall of mirrors. If you can create the appearance of mass agreement, you can induce real agreement. If you can manufacture the sensation of inevitability, you can coerce compliance without formal coercion. If you can make a position look dominant, people will drift toward it simply to avoid isolation. This is why the Internet makes manufactured consensus so powerful. It is not that people are weak. It is that human beings are social animals. We calibrate reality through others. But what happens when others are partially synthetic? What happens when some portion of that apparent crowd is automated, coordinated, purchased, or strategically amplified? Then the mass becomes not only visible but manipulable as an object. This is where bots matter, not merely as noise, but as a structural poison. Bot activity and coordinated campaigns don't have to convince anyone directly. They only have to alter the perceived distribution of belief. What looks popular? What looks fringe? What looks shameful? What looks safe? Once perception of consensus is corrupted, social reality becomes corruptible. And the most corrosive effect is not political. It is existential. People begin to feel that they do not live among neighbors. They live among factions. They do not live in a society. They live in a battlefield. A battlefield creates a certain kind of person: suspicious, reactive, unable to rest. A person who cannot rest becomes easy to steer, because rest is what allows reflection, and reflection is what breaks spells. This is why the influencer class is not merely commentary. It is a priesthood of mood. Each tribe has its liturgy, its enemies, its prophecies, its heresies, and the mass attends daily services through the feed. The result is a nation whose people are permanently mobilized but rarely organized, constantly activated but rarely constructive, always on the verge of action, but usually trapped in consumption disguised as participation. This is the central paradox. The Internet makes people feel politically alive, while quietly draining the capacities that real political life requires: patience, trust, attention span, the ability to tolerate ambiguity, the ability to live with those who disagree. The crowd is mobilized, but toward what? Often toward nothing, toward a posture, toward a mood, toward a ritual of outrage that ends, predictably, in exhaustion. And exhaustion is not a side effect. Exhaustion is the condition that keeps the machine running. A tired person wants relief. Relief is offered as certainty. Certainty is packaged as narrative. Narrative is sold as truth. Truth becomes whatever keeps you watching. That is how a mass becomes steerable. Not through force, not through persuasion, but through the steady conversion of anxiety into attention, and attention into a habit. In the next movement of this essay, the question becomes less psychological and more economic. Why the system so consistently selects ignition over restraint? Why stabilization is systematically unprofitable? And why the public sphere now behaves like a market that cannot tolerate calm. Chapter 6. Synthetic Consensus. A society can survive disagreement. It cannot survive the collapse of its instruments for knowing what other people actually believe. That collapse is one of the least discussed, most consequential transformations of the Internet era. Consensus is no longer merely contested. It is increasingly manufactured. Not manufactured in the paranoid, everything is a conspiracy sense. Manufactured in the operational sense, shaped, tilted, amplified, simulated, and made to appear more dominant or more fringe than it is. The modern public does not experience public opinion through direct contact. It experiences it through proxies, trending lists, viral clips, engagement counts, comment floods, retweet storms. Everyone is saying. The sensation of a tide. These proxies are not neutral descriptions of reality. They are surfaces that can be engineered. And once the perceived distribution of belief can be engineered, belief itself becomes steerable. Because humans calibrate what is real through what appears socially real. This is not a weakness. It is a core feature of being human. A person asks implicitly, "Am I alone? Is this sane? Is this safe to say? Is this a fringe view? Is this what normal people believe?" In a healthy society, these questions are answered through embodied life: family, neighborhood, workplace, church, local institutions, friendships that punish delusion and reward honesty. But in a society where embodied life is thinner, where people are dispersed, isolated, and mediated, the Internet becomes the calibration device. And the Internet, unlike a neighborhood, can be faked. This is where the phrase synthetic consensus becomes literal. You don't need to convince millions of people of something. You only need to convince them that millions of other people already believe it. Once that perception is installed, social gravity does the rest. There are at least 4 ways this is done, and they often overlap. 1. The bot swarm, the most obvious. Accounts that are not real people, or not functioning as real people, flooding a narrative with volume. The point is not subtle persuasion. It is temperature manipulation. Make a claim look ubiquitous. Make a position look dominant. Make dissent look dangerous. Make an event look larger than it is. Make a faction look bigger than it is. Bots do not have to be sophisticated. Their strength is not intelligence. Their strength is repetition. Repetition creates a false sense of inevitability. It creates a fog of everyone knows. It creates the sensation that resistance is futile. It creates the psychic fatigue that makes people surrender simply to stop thinking. And because large-scale swarms require resources, coordination, infrastructure, compute, persistence, they rarely represent the people. They represent power. State actors, wealthy campaigns, ideological operations, corporate interests, or domestic political machines. You can argue about which actor is doing what. The structural fact remains. The crowd can be imitated. The applause can be faked. The mob can be simulated. Once that is true, the public square becomes vulnerable in the same way a market becomes vulnerable to manipulation. Volume can be manufactured, and manufactured volume moves real participants. Engagement laundering. This is more subtle, and in some ways more corrosive. A narrative begins in a small corner, sometimes explicitly extreme or false. It is then amplified by accounts that may be human, semi-automated, or coordinated, until it crosses a visibility threshold. Once it is visible, it is covered, discussed, debunked, reacted to. In that process, it becomes normalized. Not normalized as true, normalized as present. And in a media environment where presence is often treated as significance, visibility becomes a kind of legitimacy. The narrative is laundered through reaction. This is why debunking often fails. The system makes even correction into fuel. The platform does not reward truth. It rewards interaction. So the falsehood is granted exactly what it wants: attention, repetition, and emotional charge. The false claim becomes common knowledge even among those who reject it. It becomes part of the shared mental furniture. Trend theater and the illusion of mass mood. There is a specific psychological effect that comes from watching a trend page or a viral cascade. It feels like weather. It feels like the environment. You don't experience it as someone's curated selection or algorithmic output. You experience it as what's happening. This is why it's so powerful. A person can resist an argument. It is much harder to resist the sensation that you are surrounded. Trend theater works by turning the output of a machine into the appearance of a crowd. It externalizes a constructed feed as if it were reality itself. This is where the system begins to generate a new kind of fear. The fear of social isolation in an environment whose signals cannot be trusted. People begin to self-censor, not because anyone threatened them directly, but because the perceived mass has been tilted just enough to create risk. The goal is not necessarily to convert everyone. The goal is to silence enough people that the narrative becomes self-fulfilling. Silence is a multiplier. Once people are afraid to speak, the visible distribution of belief shifts, and that shift becomes evidence. Elite invisibility and deniable sponsorship. In older propaganda regimes, the sponsor was visible. A state ran a newspaper. A party ran a channel. A tycoon owned a network. People could point to the operator. The modern world is different. The sponsor can remain hidden behind donation pipelines, foundations, independent media, funding, sponsor, relationships, influencer, management, ecosystems, algorithmic preference, without explanation. This is not about a single grand conspiracy. It is about a structural asymmetry. Influence can be purchased in ways that are hard to audit and easy to deny. This matters because it changes how power behaves. When power is visible, it can be opposed. When power is deniable, opposition becomes paranoia. People who point to manipulation sound like cranks, until, occasionally, they're proven right. And then the proof arrives too late to rebuild trust. So the public oscillates between naivete and paranoia, and either state makes it easy to govern by confusion. Now, add these four mechanisms together, and you get the real fracture. Not merely polarization, but epistemic disorientation. A citizen can no longer reliably answer, "Are these real people? Is this widely believed or artificially amplified? Is this outrage organic or engineered? Is this news or agenda? Is this a majority view or a loud minority?" When those questions cannot be answered, politics becomes less about shared reality and more about competing hallucinations. And once competing hallucinations are normalized, existential framing becomes rational. People begin to treat the other side not as wrong, but as unreal, an alien mind, an enemy species, a threat to the continuity of the world. That is the point where the public square stops functioning as a commons and begins functioning as an arena. An arena rewards combat, not comprehension. This is the hidden connection between bots and the soap opera. The soap opera is not just petty drama. It is a governance mechanism. It keeps attention cycling. It keeps tribes emotionally synchronized. It keeps the public in a permanent state of agitation, which makes them easier to steer. And it keeps power deniable. Because while the crowd fights over personalities, the deeper levers, funding, amplification, institutional decay, remain mostly untouched. In this environment, the most dangerous sentence is also the most common. Everyone knows. The phrase is a spell. It is an attempt to substitute social pressure for truth. It tries to end inquiry by invoking the crowd. But if the crowd can be simulated, then everyone becomes a product. This is why the destabilization feels ambient. It is not only that bad events happen, it is that the social fabric cannot reliably distinguish between true consensus and manufactured consensus, authentic fear and engineered fear, real movements and algorithmic swells, neighbor reality and feed reality. A nation that cannot distinguish those things becomes a nation that cannot coordinate without hysteria. And when coordination fails, the public becomes hungry for the one thing that always feels like coordination: a strong narrative delivered with certainty by a familiar face. Which brings us back to the performers and why they are elevated. Not because they are wise, but because they provide the only remaining experience of coherence. But coherence is not the same as truth. If the public sphere is now a machine that can manufacture the appearance of belief, then the next question is unavoidable. Why does the system so consistently choose ignition over restraint? Why is the default posture of public speech to inflame rather than to stabilize? The answer is not primarily moral. It is economic. And that is where the essay turns next. Chapter 7. Rage as Fuel. Conspiracy as Product. Rage is not merely an emotion in this system. It is a resource. It is harvested, refined, packaged, and sold. And once you see rage as a resource, you begin to understand why the public sphere now feels like a furnace that no one is trying to extinguish. A furnace is not extinguished because it is unpleasant. A furnace is extinguished only when it stops powering something. In the attention economy, rage powers everything. Rage does three things better than almost any other effect. First, it holds attention. A calm mind wanders. An angry mind fixates. Anger narrows perception and creates a tunnel. Enemy, betrayal, threat, urgency. It keeps the viewer from leaving because leaving feels like surrender. Second, it simplifies. Rage cannot tolerate complexity. It converts systemic problems into personal villains. It converts history into a morality play. It converts ambiguity into accusation. That simplification is not an intellectual failure. It is an emotional necessity. Complexity is disempowering. Rage restores the feeling of power by making the world legible through blame. Third, it coordinates. Rage synchronizes people. It produces a shared posture. It gives strangers a sense of unity without requiring shared life. A million isolated individuals can be made to feel like a single organism if they are pointed at the same target. These three properties, attention, simplification, coordination, make rage the perfect fuel for platforms and for the performers who survive on them. But rage does not arrive alone. It travels with a companion, existential framing. To keep rage burning, the system must keep stakes high. If an issue is merely important, the audience can take a day off. If it is existential, if it determines whether we survive, then rest becomes immoral. This is why so much modern commentary sounds like apocalyptic religion without a god. Everything is framed as a threshold moment, a final battle, a last chance, a precipice, a collapse, a betrayal from which there is no return. Even when the topic is minor, it is narrated as if it were a matter of life and death. The point of this narration is not accuracy. The point is retention. Existential framing turns attention into duty. Once attention becomes duty, the audience becomes captive. Captivity is valuable, and captivity is what the system ultimately sells. That is the hidden economic unit. Not views, not watch time, but captive nervous systems. A captive nervous system is predictable. It can be activated on command. It can be directed. It can be monetized. This is also why conspiracy is not an accident. It is a product that naturally emerges in an ecosystem that depends on rage. Conspiracy is not just false information. It is a form of emotional relief. It offers a world that is secretly coherent, an explanation for pain that is morally satisfying, a villain that deserves hatred, a community of those who see immunity against humiliation, because dissenters become sheep. Most importantly, conspiracy preserves rage by preventing closure. A normal explanation can end. A normal story can resolve. A conspiracy cannot resolve because the resolution is always deferred. The plot deepens. The enemy adapts. The evidence is hidden. The truth is suppressed. The awakening is coming. Conspiracy is an engine that produces endless fuel from the same grievance. This is why conspiratorial communities can survive repeated disconfirmation. Disconfirmation doesn't end the belief, it confirms the persecution narrative. The system protects itself through unfalsifiability, and the platforms reward it because it never runs out of content. So you end up with a public sphere where the most successful narratives are the ones that cannot be completed. Completion is death in an attention market. A finished story gives the nervous system permission to rest. Rest ends consumption. So the story is kept unfinished. The audience is kept in suspense, and suspense is monetizable. At this point, it might still be tempting to blame the audience, call them gullible, hysterical, ignorant, but that is too easy, and not entirely true. The system exploits real conditions. Many people do live in genuine insecurity, economic precarity, cultural dislocation, fear of crime, fear of status loss, fear of invisibility. Many people feel lied to by institutions. Many people feel mocked by elites. Many people feel abandoned. In that condition, a narrative that offers moral clarity and an enemy can feel like the first coherent thing in years. The cruelty of the system is not that it invents people's wounds. The cruelty is that it converts wounds into income while preventing them from healing. Healing requires truth and time. Rage provides neither. Rage provides adrenaline and permission. And permission is the most addictive substance in politics. Permission to hate. Permission to dismiss. Permission to stop thinking. Permission to treat the other as irredeemable. Permission to feel righteous without being responsible. Influencers sell this permission in different flavors depending on the tribe. The merchandise changes. The structure is constant. And because the structure is constant, you see the same theater across ideologies. Moral outrage as identity, constant breaking. Emergencies, scandals inflated into existential threats. Enemies treated as metaphysical evil. Loyalty tests disguised as moral clarity. Ritual denunciations to prove belonging. The audience learns to perform its own rage publicly as a sign of membership. The comment section becomes a liturgy, repeating the same phrases, reaffirming the same hostilities, punishing heresy, rewarding zeal. This is how rage becomes not just fuel, but culture. At a certain point, a person is no longer angry about a specific injustice. They are angry as a mode of being. Rage becomes their proof of aliveness. It becomes their substitute for purpose. It becomes their substitute for love. And then the system has them completely. Because a person who needs rage to feel alive will always return for more. This is why the pundit class feels so irresponsible. They are not merely speaking their minds. They are operating a refinery. They take raw fear and loneliness and humiliation and convert it into content. They refine it into story. They package it into daily episodes. They ship it into homes. They monetize the withdrawal symptoms. A destabilized audience is a loyal audience. This is also why so many of these figures fight with each other like characters in a bad drama. Feuds are not distractions. They are business operations. Feuds generate heat. Heat generates attention. Attention generates money. Money justifies more heat. The feud is a content multiplier. The audience watches because it provides a substitute for agency. You can pick a side, defend your champion, attack the enemy, feel morally active. It is participation without construction. And if anyone tries to cool it down, if anyone tries to introduce restraint, complexity, humility, they are punished because restraint threatens the fuel supply. In this ecosystem, stabilization looks like betrayal. This is why the good voices are not enough. A few honest historians cannot counter a machine that pays for ignition. A few disciplined thinkers cannot compete with an economy that rewards adrenaline. The problem is not that truth is unavailable. The problem is that truth is outbid, and the bidder is rage. So the next question is not, why do pundits inflame? You already know that answer. The question is more disturbing. Why does the entire system, from platforms to politicians to media to audience, behave as if it prefers the fire? Why does almost no one have both the incentive and the legitimacy to stabilize? That question takes us from psychology into political economy, and from individual cynicism into structural necessity. That is the next chapter. Chapter 8. Why no one stabilizes. If you want to understand why the temperature never drops, you have to stop looking for a missing hero and start looking for missing incentives. Stabilization is not a personality trait. It is a function that requires permission, legitimacy, and reward. In the current order, those three conditions rarely coexist. So the system behaves the way a system behaves when a crucial function becomes unprofitable. It sheds it. What fills the vacuum is not necessarily malice. It is reflex. And reflex, multiplied across platforms and institutions, becomes a national climate. There are 4 overlapping reasons no one stabilizes. Each is rational on its own. Together, they are catastrophic. 1. Calm has lost legitimacy. In a high-distrust society, calm speech is interpreted as concealment. When people believe institutions have lied, minimized, spun, or patronized them, reassurance starts sounding like manipulation. Stability becomes suspect. The person who says, "It's not that bad," is heard as complicit, an agent of the old regime, a manager of appearances. So even when a leader tries to calm the public, the attempt is treated as propaganda. Not always unfairly, but the effect is the same. The stabilizer loses credibility. This is why the discourse gravitates toward voices that are angry or alarmed. Alarm reads as honesty. Rage reads as courage. Escalation reads as authenticity. The paradox is brutal. In a traumatized environment, the language of care is perceived as an attack. So restraint becomes politically expensive. Platforms punish regulation of the nervous system. A stabilized audience is less profitable than an activated audience. The platforms do not need to tell anyone to inflame. They simply reward the outputs that produce higher engagement and starve the outputs that slow people down. The algorithm functions like an invisible editor with one criterion: keep them there. A person who can reduce heat by adding context, by naming uncertainty, by refusing existential frames, will almost always lose against a person who can spike emotion. That is not a moral statement. It is arithmetic. The platform is not a public square. It is a market whose product is attention. Stabilization reduces consumption. So stabilization is, structurally, a kind of sabotage. If you want a simple test, imagine a creator makes a video titled "Everything is Complicated, Let's Breathe." Now imagine a rival makes a video titled "They're Coming for You." The system does not need ideology to decide which one spreads. So the market selects for ignition. Politicians discovered theater is higher ROI than governance. Governance is slow. It requires trade-offs, bureaucracies, compromises, and visible failure. It produces partial wins and delayed outcomes. It is boring by design. Theater is immediate. It produces clips. It generates outrage cycles. It turns politics into branding. It allows a person to appear powerful without solving anything. In a media ecosystem dominated by attention, politicians are under pressure to behave like creators. They are rewarded for viral moments, not durable institutions. They receive more energy from provoking the other tribe than from building a stable policy baseline. And because the public has been trained to experience speech as action, politicians can do things by saying things. Outrage becomes a substitute for implementation. This is why stabilization doesn't just fail to happen. It becomes strategically irrational. To stabilize is to lower the spectacle. To lower the spectacle is to lose advantage. The audience itself has become calibrated to emergency A population exposed to constant threat cues, develops new baselines. What once felt like crisis becomes normal. What once felt like normal becomes unbearable. This is not a character flaw. It is nervous system learning. In that condition, calm can feel like emptiness. Emptiness can feel like despair. So people return to the feed not because they enjoy rage, but because rage makes them feel present, awake, oriented, morally alive. Even hatred can feel like connection when other forms of connection are scarce. So the audience punishes stabilizers too. Not consciously, not always, but behaviorally. The stabilizer is boring. The inflamer feels real. That is the tragedy at the center. The public is not merely being manipulated. The public is being trained. And some part of the public is complicit, because the alternative is to sit in silence with their own sadness. When you combine these four conditions, calm loses legitimacy, platforms punish restraint, Politicians prefer theater. Audiences are calibrated to emergency. You get a system with a single stable equilibrium, perpetual agitation. It doesn't require a coordinated plan. It requires only that each actor behave rationally within their local incentive structure. Creators escalate to survive. Platforms amplify escalation because it pays. Politicians escalate because it wins cycles. Audiences return because it regulates emptiness. This is what makes the whole thing feel like a fire that everyone keeps feeding. But there is an even darker layer underneath. Stabilization is not just unprofitable. It is risky. To stabilize is to tell people you are safe enough to stop watching. That is a promise that can be disproven by the next incident. And in an unstable environment, incidents keep arriving. So stabilizers are punished by reality. Inflamers are protected by reality because any bad news can be folded into the narrative, "I told you." The inflamer cannot be falsified. The stabilizer can. So the inflamer wins, again, not because they are right, but because their narrative has built-in immunity. At this point, the public begins to live inside a cruel inversion of responsibility. The most responsible speech becomes the most vulnerable, and the least responsible speech becomes the most durable. And then you get what we have now. A country where almost no one is incentivized to bring the temperature down, and everyone is incentivized to keep it up. Which means the constant sense of instability is not simply the result of events. It is a produced atmosphere, a climate shaped by economic incentives, psychological vulnerabilities, and the collapse of shared epistemic authority. A climate like that does something predictable to moral time. It shortens it. When every day is emergency, there is no next decade. There is only the next clip, the next crisis, the next payout cycle, the next election, the next outrage. So speech begins to behave like finance, discounting the future, cashing out attention now, extracting meaning before it evaporates. That's the next chapter. Chapter 9. Quarterly Speech. If you listen closely to the public square, you can hear that it has adopted a financial accent. It speaks in short horizons. It discounts the future. It treats attention like revenue. It treats outrage like liquidity. It treats meaning like an asset that must be extracted before the market shifts. This is not metaphorical flourish. It is the structural reality of speech in an attention economy. Communication has been financialized. In finance, the logic of the quarter dominates because quarterly reporting produces a rhythm of accountability that is legible to markets. It doesn't matter if a company is destroying its long-term health. If the numbers look good this quarter, the stock rises. The executive is rewarded. The costs are deferred. The future is someone else's problem. Speech now behaves the same way. A creator does not ask, "What will my audience believe in 5 years if I keep feeding them this?" They ask, "What will work this week?" A politician does not ask, "What will this do to institutional legitimacy over a generation?" They ask, "Will this clip trend?" A media outlet does not ask, "What does our coverage do to the public's capacity for patience?" It asks, "Will people click?" This is what I mean by quarterly speech, the colonization of moral time by short-term incentive. The future is discounted not because people hate the future, but because the system rewards those who treat the future as irrelevant. There are 3 ways quarterly speech manifests. 1. Extraction over cultivation. Cultivation requires patience. It requires building a mind in the audience, teaching them how to think, how to doubt, how to tolerate complexity, how to check themselves. It is slow, and the gains are invisible. Extraction is immediate. You pull a feeling out of the audience, rage, fear, humiliation, triumph, convert it into engagement, and cash it out. The extractive mode dominates because it pays now. The costs are deferred into burnout, paranoia, and social fragmentation, which don't show up on anyone's dashboard. This is why the most successful channels feel like strip mines. They don't build the viewer. They strip the viewer. They take their attention, their nervous system, their sleep, their relationships, and return a hit of certainty. And then, because the viewer is depleted, they need another hit. A depleted audience is an annuity. Infinite present and the death of digestion. Quarterly speech traps the public in an infinite now. In the infinite now, nothing is contextualized. Everything is urgent. Nothing is metabolized. Everything is reacted to. The public becomes incapable of historical memory because memory requires pauses, and pauses are unmonetizable. So the system produces a constant present in which yesterday's outrage is forgotten, today's outrage is absolute, tomorrow's outrage is preloaded. This is not simply a cultural flaw, it is a product cycle. If you can keep the public from digesting, you can keep them hungry. If you can keep them hungry, you can keep them consuming. If you can keep them consuming, you can keep them profitable. The result is a population that knows many facts but understands almost nothing, because understanding is slower than information. This is why people feel both informed and disoriented at the same time. They are consuming fragments faster than the mind can integrate them. Quarterly speech makes integration impossible. Moral leverage as a business model. In the old world, moral language was supposed to bind the speaker. If you invoked existential stakes, you were claiming you would accept existential costs. If you spoke in the register of duty, you were claiming duty. Quarterly speech breaks that bond. It uses moral stakes as leverage to secure attention, without accepting moral accountability. This is why so much modern commentary feels like it's playing with apocalypse the way marketers play with scarcity. Last chance. Final warning. This is it. It is a conversion tactic. Moral urgency becomes a sales technique. And because it is a technique, it can be repeated endlessly with no shame. Each time the apocalypse fails to arrive, the system does not correct. It escalates. The catastrophe is deferred, reframed, or rebranded. The audience is not allowed to rest, because rest is exit. This is the hidden reason the pundit class often seems unserious, even when using serious words. The words are operating inside a short-term extraction model. They are not pledges. They are prompts. They exist to move the viewer, not to bind the speaker. Quarterly speech also explains why so few public figures appear to mean what they say. To mean something is to be willing to be constrained by it. It is to accept consequences. It is to allow your future self to be judged by your current words. But in a high-churn market, words are disposable. The audience has been trained to forget. The speaker has been trained to pivot. The platform has been trained to reward novelty, not consistency. So meaning becomes theatrical. A person can speak as if they are defending civilization and then pivot to a sponsor read, as if no sacrilege occurred. A person can describe opponents as existential evil and then laugh about a feud like it's entertainment. A person can claim to care about the nation while operating a content machine that deepens the nation's distrust and hysteria. And they can do this because the system has abolished the one thing that used to make hypocrisy costly: embodied community. A hypocrite in a village is eventually confronted. A hypocrite on a platform is rewarded as long as they perform. This is how financial logic colonizes moral life. It turns speech into a stream of monetizable moments. It converts conviction into a format. It turns the soul's most serious language into a tool for short-term gain. The consequences are predictable. A public trained by quarterly speech becomes incapable of long-range thinking. It treats governance as entertainment. It treats moral life as performance. It treats politics as fandom. It treats apocalypse as content. And because the future is discounted, the system loses any internal reason to protect itself from its own excesses. A society that discounts the future will eventually lose the future. But the most unsettling part is this. Quarterly speech doesn't only corrupt them, politicians, pundits, platforms. It seeps into ordinary people. It becomes a mode of being. It teaches citizens to speak and feel in short horizons, immediate outrage, immediate posture, immediate certainty, immediate shame. And then we are no longer merely watching the stage. We are living inside it. At this point, critique alone is insufficient, because critique often functions as a different flavor of quarterly speech, another performance of outrage, another posture for belonging. So the essay must move to the deeper layer. Why the audience is hungry for this? Why the stage has such power? And why the emptiness that fuels it is not simply an individual defect, but a civilizational condition. That is the next chapter. Chapter 10. The Vacancy Beneath the Noise. A person does not live on narrative alone. They can survive for a while on stimulation, on identity, on outrage, on the feeling of being right, on the feeling of being part of something. But eventually the nervous system asks a simpler question. Where is my life? The modern public square has become so loud that it is easy to mistake noise for life. You can spend hours surrounded by voices and still be alone. You can feel politically awake and still be existentially asleep. You can be constantly informed and still feel that nothing in your actual existence has become more solid, more loving, more rooted. This is what I mean by vacancy. Vacancy is not stupidity. It is not moral failure. It is not an insult. It is a structural condition, the thinning of the things that make a human being feel held by the world. It has many forms: lives lived without intergenerational continuity, friendships replaced by feeds, neighborhoods replaced by platforms, bodies ignored until they break work that consumes meaning rather than producing it, sexuality turned into stimulus rather than intimacy, faith reduced to aesthetics or ideology, politics used as a surrogate for belonging, constant mobility without home. Vacancy is what happens when the structures that once stabilized identity and purpose, family, ritual, community, craft, place, become weak, inaccessible, or fragile. In such a condition, the hunger for meaning becomes intense. The mind seeks coherence the way a starving body seeks calories. The problem is that the easiest calories are rarely nourishing. The internet offers meaning-like substances that are abundant and cheap. Belonging without reciprocity, purpose without sacrifice, status without competence, recognition without relationship, outrage without construction, certainty without humility, identity without embodiment. These are not inherently evil. They are substitutes. And substitutes have a seductive property. They provide immediate relief while deepening the underlying deficit. This is why the stage is so powerful. It does not merely distract from vacancy. It gives vacancy an object and a ritual. A viewer who feels lonely can join a community. A viewer who feels powerless can participate in outrage. A viewer who feels ashamed can become righteous. A viewer who feels confused can receive a story. A viewer who feels unseen can attach to a familiar face. The platform turns these into habits. Habits become dependencies. Dependencies become a life. At that point, the feed is no longer entertainment. It is infrastructure for emotional regulation. And when the feed becomes emotional infrastructure, it acquires the power of a religion. because religion, at its best, was also infrastructure, a way to metabolize fear, grief, guilt, hope, and finitude in community. When institutional religion weakens, it does not eliminate the need. The need migrates. The migration is visible. You see it in the moral absolutism, the heresy hunts, the liturgies of outrage, the apocalyptic language, the rituals of denunciation, the saints and demons, the conversion stories, the purity tests. These are religious forms without transcendence, faith in narrative rather than in God, worship of identity rather than of the holy. A person who has no other binding structure will often accept these forms as a substitute for being held. That is why the new public square feels so spiritually degrading. It gives people the appearance of meaning while intensifying the conditions that make meaning impossible. It keeps them alone. There is another layer to vacancy that is harder to name because it implicates modern success itself. Many people are not merely lonely, they are exhausted. They are overworked, overstimulated, and underrested. They have little time for embodied life. Their attention is constantly fragmented. Their nervous system is always slightly threatened. They live inside financial anxiety, status anxiety, social anxiety, future anxiety. Under these conditions, it is difficult to build the slow forms of fullness, friendship, devotion, craft, parenthood, community service, spiritual discipline. So the person reaches for what is available, the feed. The feed offers immediate emotional modulation. It offers a quick identity hit. It offers something that feels like engagement with the world without requiring the cost of engagement with actual people. This is why the influencer class and the audience are not separate moral species. They are linked by the same scarcity. The performer sits alone in a room talking to a camera. The viewer sits alone in a room listening. Both are alone together. The tragedy is that they are coordinating their loneliness into a market. The performer learns to harvest the viewer's hunger, because the performer needs the viewer's hunger to survive. And the viewer learns to return, because the viewer's hunger is real and the feed is always open. This is not simply an economy of money. It is an economy of attention, which is an economy of life. Attention is the only thing you can never get back. So when a person spends their attention to purchase relief, they are purchasing it with their life. And if the relief is temporary, they must purchase again. This is why the whole system feels like a machine that eats time. Not only individual time, but civilizational time. The time that would have built families, friendships, communities, trust, craft, and long-term institutions is spent instead on synchronized emotion delivered through screens. Vacancy is what makes the machine possible, not as an excuse, but as a precondition. If people were deeply held, if their days were filled with reciprocal responsibility and embodied belonging, the stage would not have this grip. The performers would still exist, but they would be peripheral. They would be entertainment, not leadership. Their feuds would be gossip, not governance. The real question, then, is not why there is so much noise. The question is why there is so little fullness. And that question is uncomfortable, because it cannot be answered by blaming the usual villains. It does not yield to partisan frames. It points to the structure of modern life itself. Mobility, commodification, atomization, the collapse of ritual, the replacement of community with consumption. Vacancy also explains something else. Why people who are otherwise intelligent can become addicted to narratives that make them miserable. Misery can be preferable to emptiness. Emptiness is silent. Misery is at least a feeling. Misery at least proves you are alive. Misery offers a shape, an enemy, a cause, a storyline. whereas emptiness offers only the void. So the feed offers misery as a form of aliveness. The system is not merely exploiting a weakness, it is exploiting a human truth. The mind would rather suffer with meaning than rest in meaninglessness. This is the point where the critique becomes dangerous, because it can easily turn into superiority. Those people are empty. But the honest move is to notice that vacancy is not a subclass condition. It exists across the society. It exists among the educated and uneducated, the wealthy and poor, the left and right. It exists in people who look successful. It exists in people who are praised. It exists in people who appear to have everything and still feel unheld. Which is why the next chapter has to do what most cultural critique refuses to do. It has to admit complicity, not the performative kind, not the fashionable, I'm part of the problem, but the real admission that the hunger being monetized is not foreign. It lives here too, because if you do not admit that, you cannot tell the truth about the stage. You can only condemn it, and condemnation is just another kind of fuel. Chapter 11. I am not outside this. It is easy to write an essay like this and let it become a performance of superiority. It is easy to speak as if the disease is out there. The influencers, the platforms, the crowds, the hysterics, the gullible masses, the corrupt pundits. It is easy to sit in judgment and pretend that seeing the machine makes you immune to it. But the machine does not run on their emptiness alone. It runs on ours. So if I am going to name what is happening with any integrity, I have to say the sentence that collapses the comforting distance. I am not outside this. There are nights when I have watched the stage the way a man watches a fire, repelled, fascinated, unable to look away. There are moments when I feel the ambient instability, the strange sense that the air itself is charged, and I go looking for narration the way a child goes looking for a parent. Tell me what this means. Tell me who to blame. Tell me what is coming. Tell me that my fear is justified. Tell me that my dread has an object. And when the voice on the screen provides that object, a part of my nervous system relaxes. Not because the world has become safer, but because it has become legible. This is the seduction. Not entertainment, but coherence. Coherence is addictive. That addiction is not limited to the so-called uneducated or the extremists or the other side. It lives in anyone whose life contains too much uncertainty and too little holding. It lives in anyone whose days are fragmented, whose relationships are thin, whose body is tired, whose inner life is not tethered by ritual, community, and love. It lives in me. There is also a second seduction that is harder to admit, the desire to be the voice. When you are intelligent, when you see patterns, when you have the capacity to name what others cannot name, the idea of speaking into the void can feel less like vanity and more like duty. You can tell yourself you are doing it for truth, for justice, for the people, and maybe you are. But mixed into that duty is something that does not have to be evil to be dangerous. The desire to be seen, the desire to matter, the desire to take your private clarity and turn it into public authority, the desire to be listened to without interruption, the desire to set the frame. This is the part most critics avoid naming because it makes them vulnerable. It makes the critique less clean. It reveals that what we condemn is also what we are tempted by. But the temptation is not unique to influencers. It is a human temptation made more potent by modern vacancy. The influencer's room and the viewer's room are two sides of the same loneliness. One speaks to be held by attention. One listens to be held by narration. Both are trying to regulate a void. When I say void or vacancy, I'm not using poetic language to make myself sound tragic. I'm describing a concrete psychological reality, a lack of fullness in the ordinary structures of life that are supposed to anchor a person. If I were surrounded by what every human being is meant to be surrounded by, intergenerational family, a stable community, daily embodied responsibilities that matter to real people, love that can't be monetized, rituals that return me to the human scale, then the stage would have less power. Not no power. Less. But modern life has dismantled many of those anchor points, and it has done so while telling us we are free. We are free, yes. Free to be alone. Free to be self-authored without witnesses. Free to chase recognition in markets that cannot love us back. Free to attempt to build a self without a world. This is what makes the influencer era not just a media phenomenon, but an existential one. It is an ecology where the self becomes both the product and the consumer, both the advertiser and the audience. And when that happens, speech becomes a kind of self-medication. For the creator, speech becomes a dopamine loop. Outrage, validation, applause, attack, defense, repeat. For the viewer, listening becomes self-medication. Fear relief, certainty, belonging, hit, crash, repeat. It is not a coincidence that so much influencer content has the texture of addiction, escalation, tolerance, withdrawal, relapse. The audience needs stronger doses. The creator needs stronger performance. The platform needs stronger engagement. Everyone is trapped in the same feedback loop. This is why the stage can't be solved by telling people to be more discerning or think critically. Discernment is not only an intellectual skill. It is a capacity of a regulated nervous system. A person who is chronically anxious, lonely, exhausted, and unheld will seek narrative the way a starving man seeks food. He will not choose the healthiest option. He will choose what is available. So any critique that does not include this admission becomes a kind of cruelty. It becomes contempt disguised as analysis. The deeper truth is that the stage is, in part, a symptom of unmet human needs. And unmet needs do not disappear because they are embarrassing. They become markets. They become religions. They become movements. They become addictions. This is why I cannot pretend I am only a diagnostician. I am a patient describing the hospital from inside, which forces the essay into a different register. If the problem were simply bad influencers, the solution would be to replace them with better ones. But that would only change the aesthetic. It would not change the structure. The structure would still reward ignition, still monetize vacancy, still punish stabilization. So the actual question becomes more severe. What would it mean to live in a way that makes the stage less necessary? Not as a moral pose, not as a performative refusal, but as a concrete reorientation of life away from mediated coherence and toward embodied fullness. This is where the essay stops being a critique of others and becomes a demand made on the self. Because if I am not outside this, then I cannot simply describe the fire. I have to ask what it would mean to stop adding fuel, even in my own mind. I have to ask what it would mean to build a life in which attention is not the currency of meaning. I have to ask what it would mean to speak in a way that stabilizes rather than inflames. This is not a call to silence. Silence can be cowardice. It can also be sanity. The question is not whether to speak, but what kind of speech is worthy of a society that is burning. That is the last movement. What stabilization looks like, not as policy, not as a slogan, but as a discipline. Chapter 12. The Discipline of Stabilization. If a society is being governed by performance, then stabilization begins as a refusal. Not a glamorous refusal, not a heroic one, but the quiet discipline of not letting your nervous system be turned into a revenue stream. This is where the essay has to become practical, not in the sense of policy proposals, but in the sense of moral architecture. Because what's broken is not only information. What's broken is the relationship between speech and responsibility, between attention and meaning, between the self and the world. Stabilization is the attempt to restore those bonds. It will not arrive from the stage. It cannot, because the stage is built to reward ignition. Stabilization can only arrive through people rebuilding the capacities that the stage erodes: patience, embodiment, long horizons, and a form of speech that refuses to cash out the future for a moment of heat. To stabilize is to operate against the dominant incentives. That means stabilization must be a discipline, because the ambient system will not support it. Here are the principles of that discipline. Refuse existential inflation. Not because nothing matters, because everything cannot matter at maximum volume without destroying the mind. Existential framing is a weapon. It can be true occasionally, but when it becomes habitual, it becomes a form of fraud. It takes the language reserved for survival and uses it to sell attention. The stabilizing move is simple. Treat the word existential as a sacred word, rare, costly, and binding. If you invoke it, you owe the listener more than outrage. You owe them clarity. You owe them evidence. You owe them a path of action that is not merely consumption. In other words, do not let apocalyptic rhetoric become your daily bread. Slow the timeline. Quarterly speech is the colonization of moral life by short-term incentives. The antidote is to restore long horizons, not optimism. Horizon. Ask relentlessly, what does this way of speaking do to us over 10 years? What does this way of consuming do to my attention over 5 years? What does this narrative do to the possibility of living with those who disagree? What happens to a child raised in a household where daily life is narrated as catastrophe? Long horizons do not make you passive. They make you less manipulable. They also reintroduce responsibility. A person who thinks in decades cannot casually inflame a crowd because they have to imagine the after. Treat attention as life, not as a disposable resource. The system treats your attention as extractable. It can be mined, refined, and sold. Most people treat their own attention the same way because they were never taught to regard it as sacred. But attention is not merely focus. It is the substance of your days. It is what you give your life to. So stabilization begins with a private ethical claim. I will not donate my life to a machine that returns anxiety. This does not require total abstinence from media. It requires the restoration of agency, choosing what you consume, why you consume it, and at what cost. A person who cannot control attention cannot control thought. A person who cannot control thought cannot be free. Restore embodied accountability. The stage is powerful because it abolishes the constraints of faces. So the stabilizing move is to return speech to environments where faces exist. Talk to people in your life, form bonds where disagreement has consequences. Build friendships that can withstand boredom. Do work where the result exists. In the world, participate in communities that require reciprocity. The goal is not to flee public life. The goal is to reground it. A society cannot be stabilized by voices that are not accountable to real human beings. Refuse to turn contempt into identity. The stage monetizes contempt because contempt binds tribes. It offers a cheap form of superiority that feels like meaning. Stabilization requires refusing contempt as a home. This does not mean naive neutrality. It means refusing the emotional addiction of despising the other side as the primary way you feel coherent. Contempt is easy because it requires nothing of you. Love requires everything. Even when you cannot love, you can refuse to worship your hatred. Speak like words bind you. This is the most severe discipline because it makes speech expensive again. To speak like your words bind you means you do not say what you cannot defend. You do not claim certainty. You do not have. You do not use moral language as a tactic. You correct yourself without humiliation. Theater, you refuse to turn every disagreement into war. It means that speech returns to its ancient function. Not performance, but testimony. Testimony is dangerous because it exposes the speaker to judgment. That is why the stage avoids it. Performance can always pivot. Testimony cannot. Build fullness that makes the stage unnecessary. At the deepest level, the entire system is fed by vacancy. Vacancy cannot be argued away. It must be replaced. Fullness is not comfort. It is the condition of a life that has weight. Relationships that require you responsibilities that cannot be outsourced. Rituals that stabilize timecraft, that produces something real love, that is not monetizable. Devotion that survives boredom. Faith, if you have it, that is not reducible to identity. The stage becomes less tempting when the world is more holding. This is the final inversion. The most political act may not be posting or persuading. It may be rebuilding the kinds of lives that cannot be easily mobilized by fear. A person with a full life can still care about the nation, but they do not need the nation's drama to feel alive. They can think clearly because their nervous system is not desperate. They become less recruitable, and a society of less recruitable people is harder to destabilize. None of this guarantees a happy ending. The system is large, the incentives are entrenched, and the ambient instability is real. But the point of stabilization is not utopia. The point is sanity and integrity. If the public square has become a furnace, the temptation is either to join the arsonists or to flee the city. Stabilization offers a third posture, to stop feeding the flames, to refuse the spell, to rebuild the capacities that the spell depends on. The stage will keep performing. It will keep offering you coherence. It will keep offering you enemies. It will keep offering you adrenaline disguised as truth. The discipline is to choose something slower and more human. Because if reality has become a stage, then the first act of freedom is to step off it, and to return, not to silence, but to speech that does not need to inflame to matter. Speech that tells the truth in a tone that makes the listener more capable of living. That is what stabilization looks like. Not a slogan, a way of being. Elias Winter, author of Language Matters, a space for reflection on language, power, and decline. Thanks for reading Language Matters. Subscribe for free to receive new posts and support my work.